I'm a former journalist, and before I was a pastor, that was my field. And I knew Keri, sort of, but she wasn't attending church here by the time I came to Grandview, so I didn't know her well, but I did write to her a little bit when she was in prison in New York State, and I think you wrote back to me. And
I had a lot of time on my hands.
Yeah. And, but then, well, I kind of lost track of her, but I was aware that she was working in journalism, and so I paid a little bit of attention to that. And then, because I'm interested in restorative justice, follow a bunch of people on social media who are doing that work around the country. And one day, one of them liked something that Keri had posted in her role as a reporter for the Houston Chronicle. And I thought, that's Keri Blakinger. And her Twitter feed is amazing. So I began reading it and really wanted to invite her back to this community. So she'll tell you a little bit more about herself and why she's here, how she's interested in this topic, what it means to her, and the work she's doing today. So why don't we welcome her with a round of applause. Keri, I'm not interested in talking a whole lot about your time in prison today or what led up to that, except as it influences your reporting. But you have directly witnessed something that other journalists haven't had either the misfortune or the opportunity to witness about the people that you're covering. So say as much or as little bit about that as you'd like as we're talking. One thing that I do notice is that you maybe have better access than some reporters do, because you can empathize with some of the people that you're covering. And I also notice that when you cover somebody and uncover some misdeed that perhaps a politician or a prosecutor or someone is involved in, they may use your time in prison against you. So, as a way to try to discredit what you're up to. So can you talk to them?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's definitely, I think there's a specific Twitter exchange you're referencing there. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, that's been an issue in some cases that I've had prosecutors and prison officials say, oh, she's just a felon, like, she's coming into this with baggage, she's not covering us in a fair manner. But that's really the minority of the people that I deal with. I actually find that, I guess it's like not surprising that it would be easier to get sources that are prisoners' families, like getting them to trust me in situations where they might not be as willing to, be open with someone who hasn't been there. Like I wrote a story about this. I read a lot of really terrible and depressing stories, obviously. So, this is a lot of dark stuff. But I wrote a story recently about a guy who was beaten to death by 4 guards because he wouldn't turn over a cup that he had in his cell. So they went into cell extraction and killed him. And I talked to his family in this, and they actually reached out to me, which I think that is in part because because I have a name in Texas for covering this, they know that this is who you go to with this sort of stuff. But also, I think that people understand that I've been there, and I'll hear their side, and I'll believe them and give credence to it in a way that I think has not traditionally been done that much in journalism. I think, in journalism, as in the community as a whole, there's a sort of tendency to not believe people in prison. And so when people come with these terrible stories these are the things that happened before he got beaten to death, that's something that we haven't, as journalists, given a lot of space to. But the funny thing is, you would expect that those people who've done time and their families would be more willing to trust me because of my past. But I've also found that a lot of law enforcement officials have been really great with me. And I think that part of that is, and I was worried about this at first. I was like, when I was covering police in the area that I got arrested, I was like, oh God, I'm going to run into this guy that arrested me. This is going to be terrible. And I did at one point, and I'm like calling, like the spokesman was someone who had been there, like, and directly seen some of my interactions with the police in the past. So that was like not ideal. But, but even like outside of that, like even in Houston, I think that to an extent, seeing someone who's been through the system and come out the other side is, I think, to some law enforcement people validating, like, what we're doing sometimes has positive outcomes. Because usually, if you're a cop, if you're a prosecutor, and someone actually does turn their life around, you never see them again. You don't know about the few, like, good outcomes, because you just never hear back from them.
Okay. So you said that sometimes people call you a felon. So let's just talk about terms here a little bit. What kinds of terms around incarceration or crime do you prefer or not care for, and why?
Well, for one, I wish that, like, as reporters, that we would spend half as much time actually covering these issues as we are willing to spend like agonizing over what words we should use. Because, I mean, you see a lot of reporters discussing about, do you call them felons or prisoners or, convicts, or like, there's all these different terms, and they all obviously have different connotations, and in some cases they have significant regional differences. Like, inmate is an insult in some areas. Like, it's an inmate is like a suck up. So in some places, inmate is a real insult, in some places it's not. So there's all these regional differences, but I feel like, reporters spend a lot of time discussing what language to use. And I don't know to what extent that is true in advocacy spaces as well. But I mean, I think for me, and I think for a lot of people who did time, it's really simple. Like, don't be intentionally insulting, like that's it. I don't care if you call me a felon if I know you're not meaning it as an insult. But if you mean it as an insult, I know it, you know it, like, and I mean, in terms of like inmate, prisoner, formerly incarcerated person, like, I mean, I think that is not the best place to focus our energies. I know that, like, people first language is big in advocacy spaces. I don't really care about that personally. Like, as a reporter, like, if I have to refer to someone as like a formerly incarcerated person, if I have to remind you in every reference that that's a person and you should care about them, then I am failing as a reporter. I shouldn't have to remind you, because you should get that from the reporting. So, if I can't write in a way where it's adequate to use prisoner, then I'm doing something wrong. So I don't know. I could talk about that extensively and argue about it extensively with people on Twitter, which I may have done.
Okay. So you mentioned skepticism as a reporter about the reports of people in prison. So you have a pretty robust correspondence with people in prison. They send you things like mold samples.
Yes.
And
dead cockroaches.
Right. Just kind of demonstrating the conditions in which they're living. Yeah. So, in an effort to make seen what they're experiencing. So you also magnify work of those who produce journalism from within the walls. So can people on outside access any of that work? And how if so, how?
So, I mean, there's pretty limited journalism from prisons. There is some, obviously, Ear Hustle podcast. That's a great podcast, and that's out of San Quentin. San Quentin also has a quarterly magazine, and they have a newspaper, and there's a few different California prisons that have newspapers. And one of them, the guys send me a copy of every issue, like every month, and I just love it. Like, you can't get a subscription to it, but they like treat me like I have a subscription, and I love it. But there's also some, like the Texas prisons have one, but a lot of these are they're very censored. Like, you have such limited access. You can only write positive stories. You can't really write about the things that are going on. And there are some individual prisoners who have made some sort of like career in freelancing. John J. Lennon in upstate New York. He was actually in the last issue of Washington Post magazine with one of his essays. Like, he's a pretty prolific journalist. But there's not a lot there's not a lot of prisoners that are able to do mainstream journalism because there's so many barriers just in terms of communication and what, editors can deal with, and also what you can realistically say.
So when you get kind of direct reports, or other journalists do, I guess what is your impression of the reliability of the narrator, or yeah?
I feel like even as someone who did time, like there's some things when you hear something that's crazy enough that you default to not believing it, and in 3 years in Texas, like I have learned that like if somebody says something that's absolutely bonkers, like no, it's probably true. Like for example, I had someone who's, he was doing time in North Texas, and his wife was the one reaching out to me, sending me his letters and stuff, and she was telling me that he had been, he'd been put in psychiatric segregation as like retaliation. Sure, I believe that. Like that's in the realm of believable. I didn't realize that psychiatric segregation meant that they would put you in a room naked with no toilet and leave you there for days, and there's a hole in the center of the floor. And like, that's it. They just leave you there. And I was like, no, he's making this up. There's no way. But no, it's true. Like I went and I got the policy. I interviewed the head of their mental health, and he was like, well, yeah, that's what we do. The question on that was that they weren't denying that those conditions exist, but if they're alleging that they're only using them for like violently suicidal people, that there's just no alternative, that's a different thing than when the guys on the ground are telling me that they're being retaliated against and just being put there for you pissed off the guards today. So in that case, it's like now the first things you've told me are all accurate. I believe the rest of what you're telling me, but it's subjective, and it's really hard to prove that, Also, in that case, it's something that happens to so few people. There's not a lot of these cells, so it's not something that, there's not like a huge population of people to go to corroborate these things. But also like dentures, I heard that they were not giving dentures to people in prison, and in Texas, if you had no teeth, they would blend up your food and put it in a cup. And, you had to be underweight. You had to have like an underweight BMI in order to potentially qualify for dentures. And again, I was like, that sounds really unbelievable. But, I documented. I found the policy that says this is the thing we do. I talked to a medical director who was like, who gave me some quote about how, we've come up with a better solution than the chewing and mastication process. But that was something that I didn't believe that at first either. And then I found dozens of guys that had no teeth that had been, drinking their meals. And in that case, that sort of had a happy ending. It's a long, it'll take a long time to all play out. But after I wrote about it, the prison system started 3D printing dentures, which is very cool. And I went and watched them do that. But that's a situation where the initial reports just sound unbelievable. So I don't know. I mean, I've come to realize over time that some of the most outlandish things that you hear out of prisons, they're so consistently true.
Right.
It's just a matter of proving them.
Right. So, do you want to tell that screwdriver story that you're sort of in the middle of reporting?
Oh yeah. So this actually started with somebody gave me an email and was like, there'd always been these allegations that there were disciplinary quotas at different units, which that each guard would have to write up X number of inmates per shift. So this had always been an allegation that you can have a bunch of prisoners write you and be like, I heard the guards talking about this, but what am I going to do with that? That's not enough to report it, right? And then somebody sent me an email that I don't know how they got this. Somebody printed it out, sent it to someone on the outside, and I don't even know how I think it came from a prisoner. I don't know how they got it in the first place. And it was guards talking about a quota system. And I put in a records request, a public information request, to get the whole email thread so I could get the context of it. And they actually gave it to me. And, it was a whole discussion about, what the quota needed to be. Because they were trying to, look good on an audit, so they thought they needed to have like a certain number of disciplinary cases written per day. But I wrote about that, and that ended up, like, people ended up getting, in trouble and fired and stuff, and they said they, were going to make sure no other prisons did quotas. I mean, obviously, anecdotally, I'm still getting plenty of reports that those exist, because that's a really hard thing to just be like, we're going to stop this at 104 prisons. Like, that's really hard to just have that kind of culture change. So, but in the middle of all of that being investigated and sort of figuring out where this was going to land, there was a guy that alleged that some guards had planted screwdrivers in his cell. And, and he got written up for it, and, got punished. And he told investigators that, these guys planted these screwdrivers, I didn't have them. And it happened to be the same guys that were involved in the quota system. So the investigators, actually really investigated it this time. I mean, not to say that they don't, but I'm sure they get an overwhelming number of complaints, and they're not going to investigate them all as intensely as they investigated this one, and discovered that, yeah, the screwdrivers were planted. Because I think the guys just confessed. Not really, like, this hasn't all come, not all of the details come out yet, but, like, I think when they pulled aside the guards, they were like, yeah, we did it. I'm not clear on that. Like, we're still, like, two of them ended up pleading to felonies. And then two of them have not pleaded yet. But they're also being sued civilly. And I just got the transcripts from some of those depositions last night at like midnight. And it's crazy. I mean, they're laying out like how this happened, sort of this culture of fear and being worried about, what sort of retaliation they would face and whether they would, as guards, be physically safe if they did not, do as they were ordered and plant these screwdrivers, because they were concerned that, their superiors would, would leave them in an unsafe position with inmates and not give them backup. Right. And I haven't written about that transcript and the sort of revelations in that yet, but I'll probably do that in like the next week or so. But yeah, I mean, that's another situation where, prisoners tell me all the time I got stuff planted in my cell. And it's so rare that you actually get the investigation and the documentation and the confessions to prove it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, so you've just told this wild story from Texas, and so I think people in the North sometimes have a tendency to say, well, that's just Texas. Texas is, it's a different kind of case. And of course, Texas does have Texas-sized issues around criminal justice, but it's not necessarily unlike what happens in the rest of the country, I think. So Can you talk about that a little bit? Or that's just the South. We say that up here in the North, too.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and and I joke about it too. I'll say like, oh, it's a perfect place to be a reporter because like everything's messed up, which is true. But when I moved there, one of the first things I noticed was that like they were oddly progressive compared to the Northeast in some really unexpected ways. Mm-hmm. Like the Texas prison system has a lower percentage of its population in solitary confinement than where I did time in New York. Mm-hmm. There's actually fewer racial disparities in how solitary is used in Texas than there are in New York. They had better discovery laws in Texas, like far better, much stronger discovery in terms of like turning over material to the defense before trial. Also, like bond amounts tended to be lower than they were in New York. And obviously, I keep comparing to New York, not Pennsylvania, because I was arrested and did time in New York. So that's the system I would have comparison to from the inside. And also the sentencing, like, when you hear people in the South who get like something crazy, like 40 years for, a small amount of drugs. And then I started realizing as I'm reporting on it, they might get parole so much quicker than they would in New York. Uh-huh. Like in New York, you're going to do most of that time. Mm-hmm. I got 2.5 years and I did 5/7 of it because it was, that's just how the parole structure works on what's called a flat bid, 2.5, as opposed to like 2 to 4, which would be a split bid. So on a flatbed, you know, a nonviolent drug offense, you do 5/7. In Texas, you get out at like a quarter of that. So, you know, their parole laws end up being, I don't want to say lenient, but, you know, less, I mean, they're not as punitive as you would think when you look at the number of the sentence. The person got 40 years, and then when you actually look at when they can get out a lot quicker there. So there's all these ways in which, you know, I've discovered that there's some things about, you know, the South that are more progressive than you would think. Also, I think that, you know, there's a lot of things in the North that are, you know, worse than we remember, you know, or think about. I wrote about, when I was at the New York Daily News before I went to Texas, I wrote about these guards at Southport, which is a max prison in upstate New York, that it was this, they had like a beat-up crew where there was like 3 or 4 of them that just kept beating inmates like very badly, and this came out in lawsuits. That was how I found out about it. I knew a guy that had been beaten up by these Southport guards in the prison parking lot, and the pictures are so horrifying. Like even the New York Daily News, a tabloid, did not run all of them. But it's so striking because it would be these guys that were, I mean, this is max. They're handcuffed behind their backs every time they leave a cell. So the idea that they could resist enough to require being beaten bloody is pretty shocking, you know, and the pictures that they take after the use of force would show these, you know, black inmates in shackles, just bloodied, barely able to stand up, being held up by a white guard on either side. And those pictures did not make it online. Some of the pictures from the use of force did, but like some of the really striking ones did not even make it online. And that is in, you know, the Northeast, in, you know, liberal New York. And of course, also, I mean, Rikers Island is in New York, which is arguably one of the wildest of the large jails, at least. I mean, I mean, that's sort of subjective, but, you know, that's a jail that's always sort of been viewed among women who've been there, because that's who I've talked to a lot. I haven't talked as much to the men who've been there, as the Wild West. Like, that's what people called it. It was like the Wild West. And, you know, that's in New York City, you know. I don't hear the kinds of allegations out of the Harris County Jail in Houston that I did out of Rikers Island. And obviously that's, you know, anecdotal. You know, there are some ways in which Rikers has made progress in the past few years. But, you know, when we're talking about like, oh, that's just Texas, like, yeah, there's some things Texas does that are just bonkers. But, you know, it's there in the Northeast too.
So you just alluded to the ways that race affects the way that people are treated in the criminal justice system. You recently reported a series of articles about junk science techniques and other factors that might lead to children, and especially African American and Native American children, being taken from their homes and their parents in prison and charged with abuse. You know, racism and white supremacy obviously just through and through. U.S. systems of crime and punishment influences outcomes for people, lengths of sentences, even what is considered a crime, what neighborhoods things get charged in which they don't, how people are arrested and how those arrests are reported and punished. Can you just speak to that? I see a strong awareness of this reality in your reporting, and what do you think would help other white folks to be more attuned to the ways that this is so, and not just like in a, well, that's a shame kind of way, but in a way that we are actually doing something about it?
I mean, I guess I'm kind of a pessimist on that point. I feel like so many times, whether it's race or, you know, justice in general, like people tend to not care until it affects them personally. You know, like we see such a different response to heroin now than we did to crack in the 80s. And I mean, I know that's been talked about extensively, but, you know, crack was seen as a black drug, and we criminalized it. And I mean, obviously it was illegal anyways, but I mean, you know, that coincided with this uptick in the war on drugs, and now when it's heroin and we're starting to see it in white communities a lot more, or be aware of it in white communities a lot more, not that drugs weren't in white communities, obviously, now we're starting to see a different response to it. And part of that might be that we are, as a society, just at a different place in regards to incarceration in general. That, we spent all this money and on mass incarceration and not gotten any safer. We haven't gotten to where we wanted to be. We haven't, it seems to have not had whatever effect we were hoping it would have. So that could be part of what's at play here. But, the other big factor is the very different racial dynamics in those two epidemics. And, I think that, I think that really shows how differently people treat it when it comes close to home for them.
Okay. This room is full of reformers who are sometimes aware of things that are happening in the criminal justice system that they want to have reported on, but don't always know the best way to do that. So do you have any advice as a reporter about what kind of information is helpful to receive?
This is so much harder than it used to be in some ways because there just aren't as many reporters, But if you're trying to get a story out there to reporters, it really helps to, obviously you need to have the right reporter. You need to don't pitch it to the society reporter. I know this shouldn't need to be said, but I get so many things that are just I'm not gonna write about whatever gala. You have to get it to the right reporter and look at the stories that have impressed you and think about what elements those had and what you can bring to the table there. So, typically if I'm, for instance, this is not a story anyone pitched to me, but in terms of the elements that you want in a story and that maybe, you as advocates can bring to the table. There was a situation where a guy killed himself in the Harris County Jail and he wrote me a suicide note before he did it. And afterwards, I got it, after he died. He'd written it over the course of 4 months. I obviously wrote about, his story. And then I also, so the story had a face to the story. You want the person that will, when you're reading it, you will be oh, this is not a number, this is a real human. So you want the person, and then, you want the sort of policy, the numbers. So I have, numbers on suicide attempts. I have numbers on, completed suicides statewide and in Harris County. And then, I called some legislators to talk about what, what the legal landscape looked, or what the legislative landscape looked like around suicide prevention in jails. So the story ended up sort of being about what the gaps were post Sandra Bland Act, because we had the Sandra Bland Act after Sandra Bland's death. We had the Sandra Bland Act that was supposed to help deal with mental health issues in jails, and it left a lot of gaps. It really narrowly addressed the first few days, because that is when that's when she ended up having problems, and had there been better oversight then, aside from the issues about the arrest itself, right. It was those first few days that this act focused on. So it didn't focus on 4 months in making sure that someone is not planning to kill themselves in solitary confinement, which is exactly what happened in this case. So I had the person that was the face of it, I have the numbers, I have the state of where things are legislatively. And then after I wrote the story, the Harris County Jail decided to start a 24/7 suicide hotline for inmates. So
you can applaud that.
So if you can check all those boxes, if you have a face, a person that people can relate to, and you have a sort of broader understanding of what the legal or legislative landscape is, maybe you have some data, and that's sort of the things you need in an ideal story to potentially have impact. And as advocates, you can deliver different parts of them. There's some advocacy organizations that collect a lot of data and just, send me data sometimes. And sometimes I see a thing in it that is not what you sent it to me for, but, it's perfect for another story. Sometimes, you're really in touch with, people who are involved in the system in whatever capacity, their guards, their inmates, their families, and you can, help connect them to a reporter and be like, you know what, I think this person has a good story to tell that maybe could be part of this bigger story, and let me connect them to a reporter. Sometimes you know what the legislative landscape is, or you know what the advocacy landscape is. You know what work is being done around a certain issue. So there's different things you can deliver, and to try to, help reporters tell these stories. So yeah, I don't know. That's a very long answer to that question, I know, but hopefully that was helpful.
You've spoken about the ways that people often fail to allow the formerly incarcerated to move beyond some of the worst moments in their lives. For instance, the way that mugshots live on in the internet. Obviously, there are some very serious issues like voter suppression in the ways that we treat people after they've been in prison or even while they're there. So could you speak to the ways that that we punish people beyond their sentence?
Yeah, I think what it comes down to is that, we're really not a forgiving society as a whole in ways that, like, I think we tell ourselves that we are, but yet we give someone a sentence, they serve it, they're done, and, we're not willing to let it go away. And I don't just mean, like, you can't buy a gun, obviously. Like, there's some things where it's like, okay, fine. But, there's also, this is so random, but, like, you can't get mace in, like, New York and New Jersey, which, like, fine, who needs mace? Well, I was working, from 9 p.m. to 5 a.m. at the New York Daily News in Lower Manhattan, leaving work at 5 in the morning. And I kind of wished I could have some mace, Instead, I just wore steel-toed boots. Which actually, like, one time I ran into a dude who was, like, looking me up and down, and I was like, this dude is about to rob me. I can absolutely tell from this, like, nonsensical conversation that is going on. And he looked down at my shoes and was like, oh, never mind, and walked away, and I was like, phew. But, obviously in some states you can't vote. That's, starting to change. There's actually a lot of states where you can vote, and a lot of people who did time are not aware of this. I so frequently correct people on this. In Texas, people assume they can't vote because it's Texas. But, you can. As soon as you're off parole, you can vote in Texas. So I have voted. Now, of course, Texas is also where someone got sentenced to 5 years for voting, but she was on parole. So obviously that's terrible. But just to be clear, you can vote. Tell everyone. And then there's housing. Housing is really hard with a felony in some areas. It was not at all an issue when I was in the Northeast, but in Texas, I can't really live in a nice complex because, they have, a lot of them, it's not just even felonies, it's like even misdemeanors sometimes. Obviously for jobs, it makes a difference. And then there's things you don't expect, like, I don't know, like Airbnb. Like, they had, like, I don't know, I think they changed that, but that was in the news like a year or two ago that you couldn't do that with a felony. There's just all these unexpected ways, and some of them are things from the government, some of them are, private companies and their policies, and then, like, the sort of eternal public shaming of mugshots, that is, I met someone who actually changed his name because of, he was convicted on a lesser offense in the end on a misdemeanor, but the news story was still out there, so he ended up changing his name to avoid that. And that shouldn't have to be the case. That's kind of crazy. He did his time. He got, well, actually, I think he did like 3 days because it's a misdemeanor.
Wow.
To me, altogether, it sort of comes together like we are not as forgiving as we tell ourselves. And I am reminded of this every day in my DMs.
Yeah, don't read the comments.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, especially not the DMs.
Yeah. Okay, you did a piece on denial of color in prison that was really striking to me, and it was striking to me because I went to South Africa on a cross-cultural trip while I was in seminary, and we went to Robben Island, which is the prison where Nelson Mandela was held for 27 years. And the people who are the tour guides there were formerly incarcerated, some with Nelson Mandela. And the guard was wearing this like gorgeously blue shirt, and you could see how that really stood out against the gray of the landscape. And he said he does that very intentionally. It's his way of coming back into this space, which of course is a very difficult space for him to come back into, but in a different way that he's more in control of, because they had really taken away all color. Yeah, do you want to just say?
So I talked about color in a tweet thread, and I think on my podcast. But the reason I'd been thinking about it was because I was writing this story, and this is kind of a long detour here, but I was writing this story for Washington Post magazine about gender responsive corrections. And sidebar, Washington Post magazine did like their entire November issue was about criminal justice written by people who did time, which I think is just so cool, and because there's so few journalists who did time. So I was writing about gender responsive corrections for that. And gender responsive corrections is the idea that, you know, women and men have different needs in prison, and the prison system is built basically by men, for men, and run by men. So there's all these little ways, some are little ways, some are big ways in which, you know, a male system ends up harming women. Some of it's like, you know, it's if you're a woman who's been through a lot of sexual trauma and you've been, you know, raped while you were out on the streets dealing with an addiction, having a 6-foot-tall guard, you know, yelling at you, like, is damaging in a way that it might not be for a man who's had a very different set of histories and experiences leading up to incarceration. But there's also things like, you know, a lot of jails and prisons don't provide bras or tampons. There's, you know, one that they were making sports bras out of underwear because they just weren't giving them sports bras. You know, so there's all these ways, like the rules are typically made to control male social structures and male violence, because men are statistically more likely to pose a threat of violence in prison than women. You know, they're also more likely to be there for violent crimes. But so if you create a rule like that you can't alter your clothes because you're worried that men are going to roll up one leg to show gang affiliation, well, when women, you know, roll up their legs of their pants, they're hemming them to fit better. And yet they're both altering their clothes, and you can end up in solitary for both of those things. You know, these rules don't necessarily play out the same way. Like, they're not done, these actions are not done for the same reason, and the correctional system typically fails to recognize that. And so, I mean, there's a lot of differences from, you know, rules to the culture, to the way that, you know, you interact with prisoners, to the kinds of vocational programs that you offer. There's all these things that are very different for men than for women. And some of it's just about being decent to humans, period. But some of it's also about very specific gender differences. So I was writing about this, and one of the jails that is trying to, they're pushing for a rebuild of the jail, and they want to make it sort of the gold standard of gender responsive corrections. And that's Travis County Jail in Austin. And one of the women that I was interviewing for this is, she now works for the ACLU, but 10 years ago or so, she did time there. She'd done time off and on through, you know, years of addiction. And she was telling me how, like, so she got on this committee that was redesigning the jail. They were just sort of coming up with, like, the best case scenario of a jail. Like, no, we're not talking, like, swimming pools, but, like, what would we like? You know, one of the things was, you know, more sunlight, more color, like very basic things. But she was telling me that when she would go in to talk to the women, she would always dress in like her brightest colors and her best shiny jewelry and douse herself in perfume, because she knew how sensory deprived you are in jail and prison. Like, your whole world is in grays and oranges and beige. And, you know, that's a very powerful thing. It sounds so little, like it doesn't sound so consequential as it is, but I think the message that it sends is so powerful. Like, you are such a screw up that you don't deserve color, you know? And, you know, that got me thinking about that. That's why I ended up talking about it some on my podcast. But, you know, that's something that is so easy to correct, and I think so easy to undervalue, but can do so much to show that, you know, that you value, that you still have value even though you've made a mistake. And, you know, the other benefit, of course, is if you have more color and less sort of gray and orange, you have less of an institutional feel. And there's some belief that you will have better outcomes from incarceration if you make it more like the community, if it doesn't feel like this whole other world that doesn't ever relate to your life afterwards.
Mm-hmm.